September 1835. The Beagle spends 5 weeks in the Galapagos carefully charting the archipelago. Charles Darwin writes in his diary, "The natural history of this archipelago seems to be a little world within itself. Let's explore this world." Okay, maybe that was a little bit dramatic. Part 1. The backstory. Charles Darwin was a 22-year-old starry-eyed beetle enthusiast and amateur geologist when he visited the Galapagos Islands. Invited on the Beagle by Captain Robert Fitzroy, they travelled the world for 5 years in search of geographical, botanical and military data. He stayed on the Galapagos for 5 weeks. During his time on the islands, Darwin was not aware of the importance of the archipelago. He first focused on analysing the origin of the islands. He collected lots of reptiles, plants, and birds, among which were Darwin's finches. He visited the islands of San Cristobal, Floriana, Isabella, and Santiago. Here is a breakdown of which finches Darwin would have likely found on each island. Most notably, his visit to Santiago spurred his realization of the difference between the tortoises from different islands. At Santiago, he also collected the finches, but didn't pay too much attention to them. By the end of the trip in 1836, he'd written hundreds of pages of his findings and data. His head was full of ideas, all racing around and unprocessed. Returning from the voyage, Darwin presented the finches to the Zoological Society of London on the 4th of January 1837, along with the other mammal and bird species he'd collected. The specimens were given to John Gould, who reported that the finches were so peculiar as to form an entirely new group, containing 12 species. Part 2. The findings. From the finches Darwin brought back to England, multiple conclusions can be made. But I want to make these conclusions together. I visited the ornithology department of the Museum of Comparative Zoology to see the finches for myself. I worked with a woman called Kate, who guided my exploration in the lab. First, she pointed out the labels on the birds that helped guide our research. These contain the MCZ number and help identify and track each specimen. She showed me the Birds of the World book that indicates how the specimens are related, the organisation of the birds, as well as their geographical location. This was particularly important because the names of the Galapagos Islands have changed over the years, and without proper annotation, the origin of each bird would be lost. This book noted a few of the specimens, including Geospiza fortis, which had been collected by Gould in 1837. If you don't recall, Darwin gave the finches to Gould upon his return to England. Speaking of Gould, let's make the same discoveries he did back in 1837. First, let's compare this smaller finch with the larger one. We can conclude that the bird on the left has adapted to feed on smaller seeds, based on the size of its conical beak. We can also conclude that the finch on the right has evolved to feed on larger seeds. Both fulfill a specific niche, based on the opportunities within their environments. Next, let's compare a finch that's evolved to eat insects and one that feeds on seeds. The bird on the right has a thin and pointy beak, acting like tweezers to pick up small and delicate insects. We can compare this tweezer-like beak with the conical beak of the finch on the left, which has evolved to eat seeds. We can also see that the finch on the left has a stronger beak, as it has to crush and ingest seeds, when compared to the bird on the right, which only has to pick up insects. Now, it's important to keep in mind these birds are all finches. Therefore, if each bird has a different size and shape of beak, we can conclude that these different finches must have evolved over time to suit the conditions presented to them on each island. These variations that arose between each species gave each individual a competitive advantage, making them more likely to survive and therefore reproduce, outcompeting those with less advantageous characteristics. However, Kate and I didn't finish our research with the finches. Next, we brought out the blue waxbill. These birds from Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia are in a completely different family. It is important to note this because they have similar conical beaks to the finches. Therefore, they must fulfill the same seed-eating niche in their habitat. This provides us an example of convergent evolution, where species of different lineages independently evolve similar features as a result of having to adapt to similar environments. Furthermore, there is no phenomenon of these birds having a similar species with a larger beak, like the finches. This shows the effect that the archipelago had on evolution of the different species of finch. It created an isolated environment with minimal competition, allowing multiple species to evolve. Looking at the variation we see in the lab, it's safe to conclude that all of these finches have descended from a single common ancestor. This ancestor colonized the Galapagos and underwent an adaptive radiation, creating all the diversity in the specimens we saw in the lab. Okay, we've done it. We've reached the same conclusion Darwin did in the 19th century. In his book, The Voyage of the Beagle, Darwin wrote, "One might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends." Part 3. A Modern Perspective. Now that we've researched the finches together, let's take a step beyond. Arkath Abjanov's Darwin's Galapagos Finches in Modern Biology provides an excellent jumping-off point in our investigation. His paper also successfully outlines some of the different types of finch species we can find on the Galapagos. The warbler finch has a very thin and pointed beak, which is used to probe the leaves of the Palo Santo trees to catch small insects and their larvae. The sharp-beaked finch has a slightly larger and more conical beak. This is used to collect a varied diet of both insects and small seeds. We can find these two on Isla Genovesa. On the island of Wolf, members of the same species use their sharp, arrowhead-shaped beaks to cut wounds on large seabirds like the Mezger in order to drink their blood. The large ground finch has a massive and extremely deep beak that can be used to crush large and hard seeds that no other bird on the island can manage. Lastly, the large cactus finch has an elongated yet still robust beak adapted for penetrating the firm covers of cactus fruits and closed cactus flower buds. Let's investigate some papers and apply them to our own research. We can group the papers into two categories: genetics and behaviour. Genetics. This collection of papers adds a dimension that Darwin didn't have when he reached his conclusions about adaptive radiation. Number 1. Petrin et al. 2010. This paper used modern genetic tools such as cloning and sequencing ancient DNA to reveal that biodiversity has been lost in the Galapagos. It also helped locate the origin of some of the unknown Darwin's finch specimens. This would greatly benefit the ornithology lab and their labelling system that we discussed earlier. Number 2. Sato et al. 1999. This study used mtDNA data in order to infer the evolutionary history of the group. The data revealed that Darwin's finches are a monophyletic group, meaning they're all descendants of a common ancestor, with the warbler finch being closest to the ancestor. This phylogenetic data adds evolutionary context to the birds we've studied. Behaviour. This section will help us identify characteristics that we can't get from the collections. Number 1. Podos, 2010. Podos examined whether the medium ground finch could discriminate between a bird with a different beak size based on song alone. They found that the birds responded differently to local songs produced by different morphs. This supported the hypothesis that song in Darwin's finches can serve as a behavioural mechanism for assortative mating and sympatric evolutionary divergence. We know that allopatric speciation occurred in the finches as biological populations of birds were isolated from each other on different islands. However, we did not know that sympatric speciation also occurred. This bird is more likely to mate with a bird of a similar phenotype, and one of the ways we can tell this is through song. Number 2. Soons et al. 2010. This particularly interesting paper analysed the biometrical output of the beak/jaw and cranial muscle system and the adaptive significance of the beak shape in Darwin's finches. Looking at this specific finch, Soons et al. Would most likely conclude that this finch's beak/jaw structure would allow it to crack a hard seed without limiting the risk of beak failure. However, a smaller finch like this would risk damaging their beak attempting to crack a hard seed. It is also worth noting Dolph Schutler's study. For a smaller bird, ingesting smaller seeds would have a higher return per unit than attempting to crack larger seeds. Number 3. Tebich et al. 2010. Lastly, this paper investigated the behavioural adaptations of the finches while searching for food. By investigating all of the different behaviours of Darwin's finches, such as the large cactus finch or the warbler finch that we learned about earlier, they hypothesised that the ancestral finches were initially flexible in their foraging methods. While these modern studies have revealed a lot more about the genetics, characteristics, and behaviour of Darwin's finches, technology and research methods will continue to improve and will expand our knowledge even further. It's clear that the story of the finches is far from over.